I can do many things, but believing dumb shit has never ever been one of them. This is why I've always known that our plight has nothing to do with a Bible written by our most ungodliest enemies, and that our condition has nothing to do with a silly slave syndrome myth. I will tell you the absolute truth of our plight and condition. Telling the truth is treasonous, now that criminals and liars rule the world. Nonetheless, those who know the truth must teach African proverb. The true reason why millions of black people are now self-loathing, perceives ourselves as being our own worst enemies, and reveres Caucasians in spite of a brutally horrific history of violence, discrimination, and oppression is because a value system that serves and protects the system of white supremacy has been deliberately indoctrinated and embedded into the collective minds of black people through white social engineering. In 1968, white social scientists determined by thoroughly studying the African American culture during the 60s that there were three aggravating factors for that decade's unprecedented unified black protests. The first factor was blatant white racism. The second factor was an elevated and unifying black collective self-esteem brought on by the emergence of the Black Pride movement. They determined that the third aggravating factor for that decade's unprecedented unified black protests was that black collective aggressions towards the white oppressive society had reached a critical stage. They learned that while the white society, through their weaponry advantages of guns and cannons, were able to invade and enslave black people, they, however, cannot win our loyalty or sustain peace with us indefinitely unless our minds have been manipulated to suppress dissent from rising among us. Because whenever people are oppressed for long durations, their collective aggressions towards their oppressors will continue to grow until acts of massive unified rebellion becomes inevitable. The oppressed always eventually rebels. This is an inherent response within the collective human psyche whenever people are oppressed for long durations. This is what was happening amongst African Americans during the 1960s. This was the reason for the unprecedented unified black protests. The only way to prevent these pending acts of massive rebellions against the oppressors is by shifting the collective aggressions of the oppressed away from their oppressors and redirecting it toward themselves. Now, given that it was determined that the 1960s unprecedented unified black protest was caused by blatant white racism, by an elevated and unifying black collective self-esteem, and because black people's collective aggressions toward the white society had reached a critical stage, those white social scientists logically determined that the white establishment had to first abandon its use of blatant racist tactics that were used in the past to maintain their dominance, and instead develop more covert methods for meeting that objective, methods that are not as easily recognized by its black victims. They also determined that they had to keep the collective self-esteem of the black masses very low, because a lowered collective self-esteem prevents us from unifying ourselves against the white oppressive society. And they learned that they had to keep the collective aggressions of the black masses shifted away from the white society and redirected towards ourselves. They found what the problem was, and they said these were the things they had to address. They achieved all of these objectives by deploying an ideological subversion system against African Americans. Ideological subversion is an offensive psychological warfare tactic that uses misinformation and disinformation to change a targeted population in ways that are against their own self-interests. The technique utilizes disinformation propaganda campaigns in order to get a targeted audience to believe whatever the creator of the disinformation wants them to believe, regardless of the truth or validity of the information being promoted. It involves carefully altering the perception of a targeted audience to suit the objective of the creators of the disinformation. The term originated within the U.S. military as a part of their PSYOPs program, describing how selective information is provided or denied to a targeted audience to influence their emotions, their motives, and objective reasonings in order to promote a change in their behavior that is favorable to the creator of the content. That deployed ideological subversion system is the true reason why millions of black people are now self-loathing, perceives ourselves as being our own worst enemies, and reveres Caucasians in spite of a brutal history to the contrary. Because of the white society control the information that we receive, they feed us disinformation that shapes our minds in ways that benefit the white society. We've been made to think and behave in ways that are against our own self-interest and instead in ways that serve the white society. It's true mental slavery. Those black people who don't critically think never notice their mental change. It is time to wake up to our reality.